With the newest 3.7 update, Tower of Fantasy currently has a collab with Eva, and with it, a brand new Fortitude character, Asuka. How does she contribute to tanking in TOF? In this video, I'm going to take a look at Asuka's Fortitude kit, how she compares to other tanks, and how Fortitude characters stand in TOF's current content. So to start, I'll be going over what her Fortitude kit consists of, which is centered around the AT field she creates after using her skill. When she uses her skill, she throws her spear at the target, which draws in enemies and freezes them in place for roughly 1 second, provided they don't have hyper body. After successfully throwing the spear, she'll gain 10 vengeance stacks, each stack being used once per second while she's doing damage. If the on-hand weapon is either physical or flame, using a stack will summon a falling spear that does an AoE attack on the target. Vengeance stacks can also protect you every time you get hit, each stack being used to block damage up to 8% of your max HP. This can happen once every half second. Asuka will always create an AT field that follows her once the skill goes on cooldown. The AT field gives her hyper body and has a 30-second duration. It also provides damage reduction, which gets lower as she takes more damage, down to a minimum of 10% damage reduction. Her trait increases the minimum to 30% if Fortitude Resonance is active. And there's a visible effect of the AT field being active, as well as its remaining durability on the HP bar. Her skill has a 20-second cooldown that can't be reset or modified in any way. That's all for her kit at A0. As for her advancements, her A1 increases the vengeance stacks from 10 to 15. And if the active weapon is physical or flame once the stacks reach 0, it will summon a giant spear on the target. At A3, the remaining durability of the AT field will give a bonus to her Shatter, from the minimum of 10% to 100% if it's at full durability. A5 restores the AT field's durability by 6% every time a stack of vengeance is used. And at A6, the field gives a 15% damage buff against shielded enemies for teammates, and all nearby enemies have their resistances reduced by 12%. Everything about Asuka's Fortitude kit, from A0 to A6, is centered around her AT field skill. So naturally, her taunt comes from it as well, and wait, she doesn't have a taunt? Well, that must mean Asuka isn't a tank. Be sure to like and sub, and see you in the next video. There's an important question to ask now that Asuka has been released. Does every Fortitude character need to have a taunt? Well, no. In fact, it would not only be redundant to have every character taunt, they would also start to feel too similar to each other, leading to character balancing issues. This is something I went over in my Mimi video. I also went over in that video the 3 other goals tanks have in TOF: surviving, shattering, and supporting the team. The game gives players 3 weapon slots. If one of the Fortitude weapons already give plenty of taunts and aggro, then the other one is better off giving more survivability, shatter, or support capabilities. On that note, let's start by taking a look at Asuka's survivability. Asuka didn't lose any HP after jumping off of Cetus Island while her AT field was active. How the damage reduction works is a little confusing. I'm not entirely sure how it works myself. From what I understand, the AT field is like a separate health bar that takes damage alongside you. The total HP of the AT field seems to be half of your maximum HP. When it's completely full at 100%, it will negate 100% damage when you get hit and will instead take the damage for you. At 50%, it will negate 50% of damage of an attack, lose HP, and so on, until it reaches its minimum value of 10% or 30% with Asuka's trait. The AT field can't go below its minimum value, and will continue to reduce the damage you take accordingly. It's a very strong and unique form of damage reduction, even giving you invincibility against one hit when it's at full durability. The Vengeance stacks from Asuka's skill also block damage, up to 8% of your max HP. Exactly like Saki when she gets blocks with her skill and hold attacks. This only adds a small amount of damage reduction, since stacks also get used up whenever you deal damage. A1 increasing your Vengeance stacks, along with A5 healing your AT field by 6% every time a stack is used is a nice quality of life, but in my opinion, I wouldn't consider this necessary for the current content we have up to version 3.7. While her skill does give a lot of damage reduction, this actually conflicts a lot with her Shatter, because all of her Shatter comes from the falling spear she summons, while doing damage with a flame or physical weapon in the active slot, which also consumes Vengeance stacks. This puts the player in a tough position. Do they use their skill and use Vengeance stacks to reduce the damage they take from enemies, or do they save their skill to shatter them? To be honest, if you're geared enough, you can hold on to the skill until you need a shatter for most tanking content. Asuka's damage reduction is definitely good, but it's really not necessary if you're a veteran player who has a bunch of upgraded tanking equipment. And if you're a new or under-geared player, you're most likely not going to be the main tank, so you'll still want to save it for shattering. It's only if we ever do get content where enemies do a lot of damage, where this would become a problem. If enemies don't have a shield, then it's fine to use her skill for damage reduction. Let's see how Asuka's Shatter compares to the other Fortitude characters. So, for those of you who watched my Mimi video, you might have noticed that Saki's shattering suddenly got mediocre. Worse than Mimi using both of her skills. Well, it turns out that an enemy's shield strength is influenced by their level, and since I didn't have Saki at the time, I tested her Shatter on an account that was Dimension level 10. Even though Mimi has higher Shatter, I still discovered other things that still makes A5 Saki a little better than Mimi. To put it simply, Saki gives hit stun immunity even in the offhand slot, better taunts, and better charge rate at A5. Anyway, back to Asuka's shattering. Asuka's solo shatter comes between Mimi and Saki. If you lose a lot of Vengeance stacks from getting hit, the shatter will be lower. But the best way to shatter with Asuka is to use her skill, then swap to a flame or physical weapon with good shatter, like Lan or Shiro. Her A1 increases the Vengeance stacks while also summoning a large spear right after the last stack has been used. The large spear has a good amount of shatter if you have a physical or flame weapon active, but to do that, you have to use all of your stacks before the timer runs out on boss's shield. So, unlike at A0, you actually might want to get hit at A1 to summon the giant spear. While I haven't been able to test it, Asuka's 2-piece set could help with Shatter since you can use dodge attacks to use Vengeance stacks. I wouldn't recommend you go out of your way for the 2-piece set just for this, since it's possible you could end up doing less Shatter by trying to do dodge attacks. A1 is roughly a 15% Shatter bonus, and honestly, I wouldn't go for the A1 just for that, as it may not be very practical or realistic to get that last spear in every situation. You also need to have a fizz or a flame weapon in the on-hand slot for it to work. But Asuka's A3 is what makes her stand out from all the other tanks. She can theoretically double your Shatter, and the best part is, you don't need to have a physical or flame weapon active. There's no other Fortitude character released before Asuka who can give this much Shatter to a tank. However, the Shatter bonus will get weaker if your AT field takes too much damage. So again, it's important to save Asuka's skill for shattering. Otherwise, you'd have to build a lot of resistances and defensive stats so that AT field won't take too much damage when you get hit. It's really counterintuitive, Rather than the AT field protecting the tank from damage, the tank has to find ways to prevent it from taking damage. Also, it seems that the hologram relic doesn't benefit from the bonus, as you can see that Shiro isn't getting double shatter here. The other downside to this is you need to roll 4 copies of Asuka just to unlock this, which may be a very heavy cost for free-to-play players, but this is by far her biggest power spike for tanking. Next is her buffing and teammod support capability. There's 2 ways to do this, directly by buffing teammates, or indirectly by having high charge rate so you can discharge to another weapon that buffs the team. When it comes to Asuka's charge rate, it's not very good, but that's fine because she can't taunt, so there's no need to use her on field to generate energy. Clearly not an indirect buffer. But can she directly buff teammates? Yes, she can. All you have to do is just get lucky and roll 7 copies of Asuka. And you, my free-to-play viewers, can buff your teammates' damage with A6 Asuka. Yeah, considering the Benediction and Fortitude rolls are supposedly on the more free-to-play friendly side, I'm not a fan of having to roll all the way to A6 for Benediction or Fortitude characters just to unlock one of their abilities, especially if it's really important for them to have. Revi is a perfect example of this problem, who isn't a fully functional healer before A6. While Asuka is the only Fortitude character in Global with a very much needed party damage buff for multiplayer content, my opinion on her A6 is that thankfully for free-to-plays and low spenders, it's highly optional. There are a few problems with A6 Asuka. The first part is that the AT field gives a damage bonus to allies against shielded enemies by 15%. Bosses don't put up their shields that often, and the timer on it is usually 15 seconds at most. Usually much shorter with A3 Asuka plus shatter buffs from the healer. The second part is enemies lose 12% of their resistances while your AT field is active. I don't know why it's 12% and not 15%, but it's still decent. Except, this puts the player in a tough position. Do they use Asuka's skill to buff the team's damage, or do they save it so they can shatter the enemy? Having everything in Asuka's Fortitude kit be centered around her skill can really become problematic at this point. Imagine always using her skill to buff the team, your AT field gets damaged, you lose your vengeance stacks, and by the time the boss puts up its shield, the skill is still on cooldown. The A3 completely goes to waste. If you want to save the skill for the full shatter buff from the A3, then her A6 will have no value. In my opinion, this anti-synergy with her shatter from her A3 and her A6 is why I can't recommend such an expensive advancement for free-to-plays. The only exception to this that I can think of is where nothing in any content hits hard enough to damage the AT field. Also, Asuka likely has only so many reruns before she's gone for good, so it's understandable if you want to collect all copies of her due to her being a collab character. I just can't really recommend it, especially if you're free to play. If you're going to go for multiple copies of her, her A3 is the best stopping point. But I think now is the best time to address a problem with collab characters. Collab characters being Fortitude and possibly Benediction in the future is really problematic. If collab characters were only DPS, even if someone missed out on them, they're likely going to roll for their next new DPS instead because of TOF's power creep. But power creep doesn't really exist for the non-DPS roles. Largely speaking, each one has a unique role. And Asuka's unique ability at A3 is quite pricey. If someone misses out on her because of a lack of dark crystals, or some other reason like scheduling, then they'll miss out on A3 Asuka for good. People might feel alienated from tanking if they need A3 Asuka's shatter bonus but weren't able to get all the way to A3. So the developers would have to release new Fortitude characters who at least do the same thing as Asuka, or might end up even power creeping her. Fortitude or Benediction characters being power crept is very unusual and unfortunate. since the lack of power creep in these roles is what makes them so free to play friendly. But that's just my opinion on it. It's mainly power creep and having to roll a certain number of copies that put Fortitude and possibly Benediction players as well in a very awkward spot with collab characters. So I've gone over Asuka. She has a great and unique kit, if not a bit expensive, at A3. And the best part is, her Fortitude kit came to Global without any negative changes. Fortitude characters in Global, like Lan and especially Mimi, have had such a big problem getting entire abilities unnecessarily removed from their A0 kit when they came over to Global. Admittedly, Asuka getting such good treatment is likely because Brevi also had none of her healer numbers changed by the time she arrived in Global. So it would just add to the already existing nonsense against Fortitude characters if they didn't keep everything the same for them too. With how well Asuka has been treated by the global developers, surely tanking is in a better place now in TOF. Well, I am happy to say that no, it hasn't improved. Asuka is a solid tanking character. With her, tanks can do a pretty good job of surviving, taunting, and shattering all at once in fights. There's just one thing that they are desperately missing: team-wide damage buffs. Ever since Fiona's release, having a second healer has been superior to having a tank in the team due to the damage buffs Fiona can provide from her Link, 4-piece matrices, her Shackle, not to mention her ridiculous charge rate and great healing. That's direct, indirect, and matrix damage buffs for the team. All of the other healers aside from Nemesis also buff damage to some extent. Since content in TOF mainly revolves around being a DPS check, a second healer helps a lot more than tanks nowadays just because healers contribute so much more to the team's damage. The only exception is the Domain 9 raids because of their unique mechanics with tanks and shattering. Currently, Fortitude as a role is more or less waiting for the Ultra Tank, who can provide as many damage buffs as Fiona can. Not only through the base kit at A0, but also the 4-piece matrix set that buffs the party's damage only when Fortitude Resonance is active. Not to mention, the execution from Fiona's A3 also lets healers do a good amount of damage by finishing off enemies with low HP. Now take an Ultra Tank like that, combined with meaningful shatter mechanics and content outside of raids, where enemies also don't do much damage to a tank's AT field, and Asuka can be a very powerful character at A6 without conflicting with her A3. Or even just at A3 if Shatter can be made relevant and important enough. And then combine that with Mimi at only A0, who can reduce 15% of resistances on enemies and has good taunts. With a setup like this, tanks could at least be as strong as a second healer, allowing tanks to be used in more team content instead of the same 2 DPS 2 Benediction all of the time. Well, at least in CN anyway. Because Global Mimi had her A0 resistance reduction to buff the team's damage unnecessarily removed, the Fortitude role in Global TOF is in a much worse spot than in CN. Tanks in Global not only have to wait for an Ultra Tank with Fiona level damage buffs, they also need to wait for a tank who can taunt like Mimi and also make up for her missing damage buffs. Unless the developers want to give all of that to the Ultra Tank. Even then, now that Grievous has been removed from the game, Mimi and Lyra have less of a gap in terms of damage buffs in CN. Since Mimi can also activate 4-piece 0 with her team shielding, along with her 15% resistance shred. This lets healers use someone other than Lyra, such as Brevi and Coco for more damage. Global won't even have this level of flexibility and choice. I can't believe that Global is going to have worse balancing and fewer options than in CN, at least for Benediction and Fortitude characters. But here we are. Honestly, it is just so absurd that Mimi had her A0 party buff removed in the first place. But this is really all speculation on what could happen in the future. For all I know, the altered tank could take another year or two to release, or she might provide no damage buffs to the team. Shattering enemies in content outside of the D9 raids could still be unimportant, and boss shields can continue to be ignored. Who knows? My point is, while Asuka is a good tank, she can't really be used outside of raids in the current state of TOF. Fortitude has fallen off by quite a bit since I last made my video on Mimi, only being as useful as healers in raid content thanks to the special mechanics. The tanking role in TOF needs Fortitude characters who can provide all of those party-wide damage buffs to meet those DPS checks and contribute as much as healers do. It would just be nice for the Fortitude role in TOF to at least become an extra option in playstyle for people, while also not strictly required if people don't feel like tanking. Because it's not interesting seeing the same 2 healer, 2 DPS teams over and over again. Hopefully, Tower Fantasy can give Fortitude characters and the role itself the buffs they need sooner rather than later. That's all I have to say on Asuka and tanking's current situation in TOF. If you liked the video or found it helpful, be sure to like and sub. See you all next time.